The People's Platform.
Well, what a week it has been. It's a roller coaster ride when you talk about the global economy. We have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow or even in the next few hours. Tariffs, counter tariffs, countries and statesmen and economics ministers and professors all stumbling around, trying to figure out what this world is going to look like this year, next year, and into the future, because there is so much uncertainty. Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. On behalf of the Newsfirst team, I'm Niresh Eliathambi. Now, I have with me an expert in the area of economics, fortunately for us, who we hope will give us a little bit of sanity on what's going on. She is none other than Professor Jayati Ghosh, who is very well known, and we have had her on our programs several times before. Good evening, Professor, and thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Right.
Now, just to introduce you briefly, you are currently a professor who is attached to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, but for something like 3 decades you were a professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, so some very prestigious universities, but you have of course many other accomplishments which I'm not going to list out. Right, and you are currently in Colombo to attend a conference, and we managed to get hold of you at this point. Right. So now, Professor, what's your take? What is the world going to look like in for the rest of this year? And I know this is you could say it's anybody's guess, but we look to learned persons such as yourself to sort of calm the waters and try to tell us what may happen.
I think the only thing we do know is that we don't know. In other words, that it's going to be very unstable, very volatile, and a lot of it is going to be quite bad. Sorry to say.
Okay, yes. Now, global economics or even national economics dislikes the uncertainty, the shocks. Businessmen and women want stability. They don't want governments bringing in new taxes or new restrictions, and especially when you get these sudden worldwide issues. It could be oil prices, it could be wars, but suddenly this is all about tariffs. It's basically everything opposite to what business is all about, isn't it?
Well, it's very interesting because in a way it's like, as you say, it's opposite to what business is all about, but it's also a complete rejection by the country that actually set up this current world order. And that, I think, is what a lot of people are finding it hard to get their head around, because the US economy actually created the current international order that we have grown up in. And the whole process of globalization, etc., was really done under the aegis of the US. And all of these institutions, whether it's the IMF and the World Bank, or it's the World Trade Organization, or all of the other things, were really designed in a way to favor the US.
Absolutely.
So it's a shock to realize that now it's the US which is trying to not just dismantle it, but taking a wrecking ball to it, actually.
Yes, indeed. And in fact, the US has been heading this global economic order for well over a century. I think if you look back somewhere around World War I, the British Empire started reducing in size and crashing, but the US was in the ascendancy, and perhaps even before World War One. So it's been over a century, and it, like you said, it's been to the design of the United States.
Well, definitely after the Second World War, that's absolutely true. That, it's really been, in a sense, the US has been the hegemon. Now, so let's try and imagine now a world not just without a hegemon, but a world in which the hegemon is trying to break the established rules that it benefited from. And there are very few historical analogies we can make, but it's interesting that you talked about the period after the First World War, because that was also a period without a hegemon, really. As you said, the British economy was on the decline. It wasn't in a position anymore to kind of, make the rules or even to force other countries to accept them. The US hadn't fully emerged at that point. It was really the Second World War that helped the US to emerge. A lot of European countries were vying for power at the same time, right? France, Germany, etc. So it was a very unstable period, a volatile period. There was no clear hegemon. We're in that position today. There is a hegemon who doesn't actually want to take on the responsibilities of a hegemon and wants to break the system that made it the hegemon. There is a rising power. We all know that China certainly has now increasingly global ambitions in a way that it didn't have maybe 10, 15 years ago. And there's a whole sense of not really knowing, which of these will succeed. How do other countries fit into this? How are they going to be able to actually respond to the different challenges that come up? Because the critical point is that the rules of the game that were very, very systematically established by the US to benefit the US, Europe, and the other rich countries, and which other countries found ways to work with, those rules of game have gone.
Absolutely. So all the economics textbooks that we learnt, they've gone out of the window. The marketing books, the economics books, the international commercial law. What's the role of the World Trade Organization? We don't know what. There's nothing that is certain. It's true. And at one level, that sounds terrifying and it looks like it's the end of the world in some ways. But if you again look back in history, these periods of global instability, of not having clear rules, are also periods when countries that have not been the big gainers from these rules, that is the countries at the lower end of the ladder, have found opportunities to grow and to succeed. So if you think about it, the US emerges in a period of sort of, global volatility and depression, the 1890s onwards, as you mentioned, and then again in that period between the two world wars. Right, the Great Depression.
Yeah, exactly.
And onwards.
Japan emerges in that period as well as a significant economy. Korea and Taiwan, China, and all of these Asian dragons, tigers, whatever, they emerge in the 70s and 80s, which is another period of flux, and nobody really knows what's going to happen next, and the earlier rules have been disbanded. So in a way, this period of instability can also be used by developing countries to change their position in the global division of labor. Because the thing about very fixed rules is that they also kind of fix you in a particular position. It's very hard to get out of, let's say, just being an exporter of tea, coffee, and garments, to take what's happening in Sri Lanka, to move into other areas, to find new trading partners, to get new ways of thinking about your economy. It's hard to do that if the rules don't really allow you to make those changes.
Right. So now we've grown up in Sri Lanka with, we need to export more. So we've got our traditional tea, garments, things like that. And we've got tourism coming in as well. But now we don't know because, the US is a major market. But so are Europe and so many other regions. So we don't know what the fallout will be on all those regions, and whether we are going to head into a recession. Will those regions have buying power? Will European tourists have the money to travel to Sri Lanka? and forget European tourists, Chinese tourists, Indian tourists. So it's all uncertain.
It's uncertain, but here's the bad news. The one thing I'm certain about, yes, certainly in the short term, there will be a recession. There will be a global recession, and it's going to be pretty bad, definitely for Sri Lankan exports, Sri Lankan remittances, Sri Lankan tourism. Yes. But the other bad news is that, in fact, that export-led model is over. It's dead in the water. This is no longer a strategy for economic progress. And that's going to take some getting used to, and it's going to take a lot more imagination on the part of policymakers, not just in Sri Lanka, but all over the world. Because right now, we know that, yes, the markets are unstable, the US market will shrink, Europe is probably not going to take up the slack, China, again, will not do enough to take up the slack. So, yes, all of our markets are going to suffer. But that broader strategy, that you use exports as a means for raising the per capita incomes overall, and of diversifying your economy and shifting out of low value added production, that model is dead. We have to think of new ways, and there are new ways that are probably better for our people.
Okay, could you suggest some of those ways? I mean, again, you are trying to gaze into a crystal ball here, but what might be some of the ways in which countries like Sri Lanka could turn this around?
Well, first of all, think of it how it has played out in Sri Lanka. That you've relied, as you say, terrifically on exports, and they've been in broadly, low value-added garments and things like that, but also tea, coffee, plantation crops, and so on, and tourism, right? These are your big foreign exchange earners. To what extent has that meant that you've actually been able to improve the living conditions of most of your people? It hasn't.
Not much at all.
Exactly.
Not much.
So in a way, it's not a bad thing that you should not keep relying on that, and that you can't keep relying on that you have no choice. In other words, it's a great opportunity to rethink the model. Think about viable, sustainable agriculture, for example, based on not just small farming, but cooperatives. Think about small and medium enterprises providing different kinds of services, providing manufacturing goods that are used by the local people. Again, think of systems like cooperatives for that. Think of specific packages that deal particularly with micro, small and medium enterprises. Don't be obsessed with exports. In other words, see your domestic market, see wage increases as a way of increasing your domestic market. See improving conditions for agriculture as a way of not just sustainable production, ecologically viable production, but as a way of increasing your domestic market for non-agricultural goods.
So domestic markets are going to rise in importance.
Domestic and regional, I would say.
Right.
And when I say regional, I don't just necessarily mean the South Asian region. I'm thinking really of more plurilateral arrangements. And I think we're going to see more and more of those.
Right. And what about other regions like Europe, which and Southeast Asia, for example? I mean, they are powerful. They do have a lot of buying power. But the US was always the big guy on the block. But should we now be focusing more on Europe, India, Southeast Asia?
If you look at patterns of trade, even in the last decade, most trade of developing countries has grown fastest with other developing countries. And it's not just China. Yes, China is a big player in that, but it's all other regions. So it is South Asia, it is Southeast Asia, it is Latin America, it is Africa. So we should be actually much more open to that, because that's really where a lot of the action is going to come in the next decade.
Right. Now, the US remains the biggest on the block. And in terms of the wealth, Americans have the world's money, basically. But now the projections are terrible for the US economy. Job losses and investment losses and so on. And the Dow Jones, don't even talk about the Nasdaq and the Dow Jones and all that. I'm sure A lot of investors in the New York Stock Exchange have had heart attacks, and they might have even died. You just don't know because it's been that bad.
Yeah.
But if the US goes into a serious recession, would that have a knock-on effect on the entire world?
Oh, absolutely, yes. That's why I said in the short term, the news is really bad. And that much we know. And when I said we're uncertain, what we do know is that it's going to be bad, okay, in the short run. But then we have to really think about, do we just lie there and let it all happen? Or do we do something about it? And I'm saying that this is really a moment where developing countries can stop and say, wait a minute, this was the wrong growth trajectory. Let's do something that benefits our people. Let's focus on employment generation. Let's focus on sustainable, viable agriculture that is not creating unhealthy food systems. Let's focus on the kind of manufacturing that is not massively polluting and, warming the planet and so on and so forth. Let's think of different kinds of services. So it is really a possibility. In other words, it's a shock and it's bad news. But that shock should actually make us concentrate our minds and shift to a much more viable economic pattern, which is in fact possible, which is available.
Right. Now, how are countries like India and China going to deal with this? It's a strange situation. Some countries have fairly good relations with President Donald Trump, but that didn't stop him at all when it came to these tariffs and so on. He just, his friends seem to go out the window, except, very few exceptions. So he's basically taken a broom to the whole world's economy. But how would, for example, India, how should India deal with this?
I would say for India, even more than for Sri Lanka, that it's really a moment to rethink our development strategy. Because, we have actually failed, certainly over the last decade, but even over the broader 2 decades, we have failed to shift people out of low productivity activities. They're all stuck in low productivity agriculture and low productivity services, which is not what you want, only 5% of our workers even have formal jobs. And we have an increase in employment with what? With women working in unpaid fashion and family enterprises. That's not employment. So we have really failed miserably in terms of supposedly high growth, where the benefits go only to the top 10%, and where employment doesn't increase. And certainly good quality jobs are coming down, not going up. So we have to rethink, and we can, because we are potentially a huge economy. We have maybe 1.4 billion people. We don't know because we haven't had a census for a long time. But we're a very large economy, and potentially even larger. So there is a huge scope for a different strategy of development. One that doesn't destroy the planet, one that doesn't pollute us so that, in Delhi, I live in Delhi, we will lose 13 years of our life just by living there and breathing that air. We can change all of that. We can actually shift to a different pattern of development that is healthier, happier, more equitable.
Now, has Donald Trump made the US less relevant in the long term?
Yes. If he wanted to push US decline, he couldn't have done it better.
but his stated objective has always been to make America great again.
Yes.
But I don't see how that's going to happen.
So, it's very, I don't know how many people would dare to think of the workings of Mr. Trump's mind, but the supposed logic is this, that you will actually reduce US reliance on imports, which according to him is reducing manufacturing jobs and denying workers higher wages and so on. But at the same time, you will keep the dollar as the dominant reserve currency by forcing all the others to do a Mar-a-Lago accord, where they will voluntarily appreciate their own currencies, but keep holding US debt. He wants to convert a lot of the US Treasury bills into 100-year low-interest debt. So he wants all these things together. Can't happen, right?
Not going to happen.
Yeah.
Different countries have different priorities,
Yes.
and this kind of shock therapy is really not going to go down well with the rest of the world.
Well, the shock therapy is, I think, in a way good for us. I mean, of course, it's painful, yes. And it will lead to job losses and lots of tragedy, just like, the closure of all the USAID, etc., has led to tragedy for HIV/AIDS victims and so on. But it does concentrate our minds to think of managing without the US. Saying, oh, we're going to export to the US, so we're fine. Actually, the US accounts for only 15% of global trade at the moment. We're saying, oh, the US is going to take over and, provide the money for the UN, etc., etc. No, let's think of it without the US. Let's think of ways of cooperating, ways of going forward, ways of trading, engaging in investment, and doing sustainable activities in a way that doesn't destroy the planet.
Now, Professor Jayati, the US dollar has been the world's reserve currency. And we've gotten used to that over the decades. Is that likely to change?
It's inevitable. It will, of course, change, because that's also in the nature of things, right? It was the dominant currency because it was power. It reflected the US economic, political, geostrategic power. That's no longer as large. There's a legacy effect, and it's not going to go tomorrow. It will take time. But there was a time when pound sterling was the dominant reserve currency, and people grew up with that and could not imagine a world without that. Now, in fact, you can't imagine pound sterling being a global reserve currency.
Absolutely, yes.
So, yes, it's going to take it's not going to happen tomorrow, but definitely the direction is clear.
Well, one of the reasons that the US dollar was so reliable was because the US government was reliable, the US economy was reliable, and you could actually predict it because it was very transparent. We saw, daily reports on what the Dow Jones was doing and NASDAQ and the number of jobs created, the inflation. I mean, it was highly transparent. So you could, economists, could just try to predict what's going to happen, next month and throughout the year and
the
so
interest rates and so on.
Exactly. But now, none of that matters. So that predictability, that reliability of the US economy and by extension the US dollar, I suppose it's gone out the window.
You see, you're right that some of it was about reliability, but I go back to it. It was also about power. Okay, there was an economist called Charles Kindleberger, an American, who said money is about power, international money is about international power. And that's why the US dollar was dominant. It did reflect its power. Now, here is a man, or shall we say an administration, that says we are going to make us even more powerful and great, but is doing everything that would actually reduce that power. And it's forcing all the other countries to plan B, to look at alternatives, to look at different strategies. And they're going to find that those other strategies work.
Absolutely. We need to take a short commercial break. We are in conversation with Professor Jayati Ghosh, who is a well-known economist. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
The People's Platform.
ඔන්න මෙදා සැරෙත් අවුරුද්දට අපි එනවා
කන්තලේ මධ්‍ය මහාවිද්‍යාලීය ක්‍රීඩාංගණයට
අප්‍රේල් 19 දවස පුරා
අවුරුදු සිරියෙන් පුරවන්න ඔයාලත් එන්න
අවුරුදු කුමරා කුමරිය බයිසිකල් ධාවන තරගය
ඔරුපැදීමේ තරගය සහ ජන ක්‍රීඩා රසක් සමග
කුරුණෑගල බැජී සංගීතයට ජනප්‍රිය ගායක ගායිකාවන් ගී ගයන
නැගෙනහිරට අවුරුදු
අප්‍රේල් 19 වනදා දවස පුරා
කන්තලේ මැදි විදුහල ක්‍රීඩාංගණයේදී.
The People's Platform.
Welcome back to the People's Platform. speaking with Professor Jayati Ghosh, a well-known economist. Now, Professor, let's talk about IMF programs, bankruptcies around the world. Many countries in all the continents were already stressed when it came to their governments, whether they have money or not, basically. And right now, at the moment, there are 35 countries on IMF programs, Sri Lanka being one of them. But what's going to happen to these countries which are either on the verge of bankruptcy or they are in bankruptcy? How relevant are the IMF terms and conditions and best practices, you might call them, which the IMF brings to countries? Some people don't like the practices, some people do, but it's all now, has it all shifted now? Because those guidelines are for a world which doesn't exist anymore.
I think, in fact, I would say it slightly differently. I would say that the IMF for a long time has not lived up to the principles that are there even in the memorandum of agreement of the IMF. It was supposed to provide liquidity for countries in distress. It was supposed to provide it quickly and effectively, and it was supposed to enable those countries to get out of that crisis. What do we see instead? We see a pattern of massive repeat lending. There are some countries that have been on 15, 16, 17 IMF programs. I think Sri Lanka is one of them.
17, yes.
There you go. Pakistan, Philippines. I mean, there's a bunch of countries that are repeatedly on it. And anyway, it comes very slowly, it comes inadequately, and it comes with conditions that typically make the problem worse. In other words, what we call pro-cyclical. So if it's a downswing, it adds to the downswing by saying you have to spend less. You have to reduce your spending, you have to do austerity, you have to cut pensions, you have to cut workers' salaries, and, tighten your belts.
Right,
too.
all of which reduce spending, consumer spending, and so on.
And make the economy worse.
Yeah, so you're reducing economic growth. I mean, some countries like Sri Lanka, the economy has bounced back, but that you can't really say that it's because of the IMF conditions. It's just sort of we went so far down. I think we hit rock bottom, and we slowly started climbing back up.
Are you back to pre-crisis levels?
Not at all.
Exactly,
no, we're
that's
not.
the point.
Yes.
I mean, Greece is still not back to its pre-crisis level of 2009. And we're talking 2025 today.
Yes.
So that's the kind of terrible impact it can have if you actually follow their instructions blindly. So it's very unfortunate because it's not like they don't know. So, for example, when the US had that big global financial crisis, the IMF says, yes, they should spend more. Because you have to be counter-cyclical. You have to bring the economy out of this. You have to grow out of the problem.
But that didn't apply to us.
It doesn't. It's a complete double standards.
Okay. So now what happens? Now the 35 countries which are on IMF programs, do we get to renegotiate this? Because our reality, the world's reality has changed.
I mean, I think there's no question that countries must renegotiate. Because this is not just a sort of minor change. This is like a volcano that has happened, or a massive tsunami or something. This is a huge, huge shock. And I mean, consider Sri Lanka. You have, 20% of exports going to the US? But it's not just the US. All of the regions are affected. So all your exports will be down. Your capital flows will be changed. Everything is going to change. Your tourism money will go. Your remittances money will come down. So this is a major, major shock. None of the assumptions that the IMF made in its debt sustainability assessment, which, by the way, anyway, was a really bad assessment. It had all kinds of problems with it. But none of those assumptions is at all valid anymore. So there's no question that certainly Sri Lanka, but pretty much every IMF debtor country must renegotiate those terms.
Now, one of the questions that always troubled me, and whenever we had economists on our programs, which we do frequently, that question was, what happens if there is a global crisis, some external shock. Because I have seen over my 35-year career Sri Lanka being buffeted around by things like war in the Middle East, oil prices, the recession in the US. They all impacted in a huge way. So I was thinking of such factors, but not this one. Of course, about a month ago, we did do a series on what might happen if the tariffs came into play. But even then, we never dreamt it would be this bad. So this is it's like a tsunami worldwide.
Yes. But again, in the IMF's broader principles, there is a possibility of dealing with this. And in fact, in the 70s, when oil prices rose first, that very big oil price hike, they had something called the compensatory financing facility. That is, you're compensating countries for shocks that are not of their own making. Because what do you do if suddenly, the oil price goes up 3 times, you're an oil importer. It's not your fault. And your balance of payments goes for a toss completely. So that was the idea then. And there is another instrument available to the IMF. The IMF creates liquidity. It's called special drawing rights.
Right.
Yes. And if you remember, during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was one new issue of special drawing rights of $650 billion, which is the maximum you can do without having to go to the US Congress. Now, why does this matter? Because the US has a controlling veto in the IMF. They hold 16% of the shares. You need 85% to make any major decision. So they have that 1% extra, so they can stop anything from happening.
Right.
Now, as a result, the IMF has pretty much done what the US wants it to do over the years, which means it's been inadequate in all of these major crises, which it was set up to deal with. In fact, if it was a properly functioning IMF, as is suggested in that Articles of Agreement, it would have immediately provided a massive new issuance of SDRs and enabled and actually distributed them not according to quota, which makes no sense, because by quota, 60% of these SDRs go to countries that will never use them. The US, Europe, Japan, Korea, etc. Distributed according to need. Distributed according to the countries that are facing the biggest shocks and are the least able to deal with it. This is a proposal that was made by a commission that I was on. It was a UN High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism. And we said we have to actually make sure that these SDRs are used, that they are issued regularly and used in this way. So potentially it could do all that. The trouble is that because it is controlled by the US and additionally Europe, it's unable to do the kinds of things that it could have done if it actually worked in the way it was supposed to.
Right. So what are we likely to see with the IMF and the countries which are in its programs?
I wish I could be more optimistic. You know what they're like. They come and then they send a team and then they wander around and they say, oh yeah, well, you have to do the following things. They take about a year before they can come to a decision because they're negotiating. Then they give you a tiny little amount, very small, relative to your need. And they spread it over 3-4 years.
Yes.
And then they force all kinds of conditions on you for that tiny little amount, because they say that will enable you to get all that private capital in, which wouldn't come otherwise. And then they're very surprised when, in fact, the economy gets worse and the private capital doesn't come in. This is a pattern. You can go blindfold into about 80% of the countries that have had IMF programs and say this is what will happen. And that's unfortunately what does happen.
Now, Sri Lanka, when it went into this bankruptcy and this 17th IMF program, the government of Sri Lanka seemed to be stumbling in the dark, despite having been to the IMF 16 times previously. It seemed to just sort of wander around. The level of transparency was certainly nowhere near what it should have been. And this is the previous regime in Sri Lanka. And then we were, this was just foisted on the public. And then everything, that regime blamed the IMF for every little decision, which half those things were not the IMF's creation, when it was IMF. They want us to do this, but this action, this unilaterally stumbling around action, can we get away from that? Now, there's 35 countries who are in IMF programs. Why haven't they grouped together and shared their knowledge, and any new country which is going bankrupt, advise?
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I have been saying for such a long time, we need a debtors coalition. We need countries that are forced to go to the IMF exactly to share experience, to share the knowledge, to share their own debt sustainability analyses rather than just use the IMF's version. So definitely we need all of that. But if I had to be cynical, I would say that, it's not a government stumbling in the dark. This is the same government run by the same elites that got you into the mess.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
So they're not stumbling in the dark. They're just making sure that they don't have to bear the costs of that mess. The elites get off scot-free. Who suffers? It's the working people.
So that was very apparent in Sri Lanka.
It's been apparent in pretty much all of the countries that have done this. So it's a combination of the domestic political economy and the IMF. And then they can blame the IMF. They can say, what can we do? There is no alternative. These are technocrats who are telling us we have to do this. It's the interests of global capital combined with the interests of domestic elites. But once people realize this, and if you have a progressive government that is genuinely interested in doing something for the people, you have to call that bluff. So I would say in countries where there has been a change of government, Sri Lanka, Ghana, Senegal, all facing IMF programs, they should actually say, no, enough already. Let's actually think of a program that provides some relief to the people, that improves their conditions, not forces more punishment on them. Let's actually punish those who benefited from that previous boom. Let's stop the illicit financial flows. Let's tax the extremely wealthy. Let's tax the multinationals, the same rate as we tax domestic companies. It can be done. It just needs confidence and perhaps, as you say, sharing of information in ways that governments could actually get together and implement these together.
Is it time for these countries on IMF programs to come up with their own program and go to the IMF and say, this is what we intend doing.
Yes.
This is how we're going to come out of this mess. We need your support in this way.
Yes.
And we'll take care of the rest.
Absolutely. In fact, that is what in Argentina, Martin Guzman, who was the finance minister, he tried to do that. Unfortunately, the politics in Argentina changed. But that is really what they should do. And if you look at what the IMF claims that it's the countries that are suggesting this. That, we had nothing to do with it. This is the government's program. We're just agreeing to most of it. In fact, it's about time for countries, especially countries that want to do something for their people, that are progressive in their orientation, to insist on their own program, their own debt sustainability analysis, their own way of dealing with the crisis.
In Sri Lanka, there also seemed to be this inferiority complex. We really don't know how to get out of this. Let's bring, the IMF and all our creditors. They'll set the terms and conditions, and then we'll sort of negotiate a little bit and come up with solutions. But that clearly didn't work. So many people are unhappy about conditions.
And they're making things worse in the economy. So
Right.
it's not just people who are unhappy, the economy is showing it as well, right?
Yes. But do countries like Sri Lanka, like Ghana, Argentina, do we have the expertise?
Of course. What you don't have is the confidence. Exactly what you said. It's this inferiority
complex.
And that's why it is so important to share information, to share knowledge, to share strategies, and to actually work together. Because, doing something coordinated is much, much more effective than just trying to do it on your own. On your own, you're battered by not just the IMF, but the bilaterals and all of those private bondholders who come at you like so many vultures. And it's terrifying. So it is very difficult for a country individually to negotiate with that massive array of all these really shark-like creditors. But if you are joined together and you're sharing that information and you're saying, well, look, you're saying we have to cut down on this, but it will actually make things worse, not just for our people, but for the economy. and the similar thing is being said in Ghana or in Senegal or in etc. and etc., it makes a big difference.
Now, Professor, let me ask you about multinational corporations, MNCs. They're all the rage. We learn about them in economics classes and marketing and so on. They dominate the world's trade. The Nvidias, Apples, Microsoft, all those companies. So many American companies, but you also have European ones, Chinese ones, Japanese ones, and so on. But there are only about 300 or 400 of these multinational corporations which dominate world trade. What is their future? Because they've been so important, so powerful, but now in this new economic order, what would be their future?
Well, right now the attempt of certainly the Trump administration is to increase the power of US multinationals. But they are already obscenely powerful. Okay, they are bigger than most governments. They can bully and force most governments to change their policies and regulations to suit them. They pay very little tax because they shift all their profits to low tax jurisdictions. And overall, they have much greater power than the average government. Okay. Now, what we have to do is actually reduce that power, because all the ways that countries operate, they can only deal with that bit of the multinational which is in their own country. So whether it is taxation or regulation or anything, you can only affect that part. We have to see that company as one global company, and then every government says, well, all right, my share of your global profits is so much, let's say 1%, 2%, based on sales and employment. And I'm going to tax my share of your global profits at the same rate that I tax a local company. So we're not saying you have to tax them more, we're saying just tax them the same. And I will insist that you have to have the same regulations as my local companies, and so on. Yeah.
Right. So it may be good news for the rest of the world when it comes to that, but you can be certain that the best brains in these multinational corporations are already working overtime to ensure that they get the best out of the mess that has been created.
Yes, there's no doubt about that. We should never underestimate the wiliness of, if you like, I won't say the enemy, but the other in this case. There's no doubt about that. But I think, again, there is this lack of confidence when dealing with size. And that comes in so many ways across the developing world. And the only way to combat size is to combine. So it's just like workers, when they get together, are more powerful than a single worker alone. Countries facing these big, humongous, gargantuan, powerful entities have to actually join together to confront them. And it can be done. It just needs much more political will and more confidence, really, on the part of some of our leaders.
Right. And also one final question, because we're almost out of time. What of the Middle Eastern economies, which, the rich countries in the Middle East, which were doing very well on the back of their oil revenues? Now, already oil prices are fluctuating like crazy because when if you have a global recession, then there's less need for oil, whether it's your factories or energy or whatever. So, basically the revenue of those oil-rich, especially OPEC countries, would be less. So what can we project for the Middle East? Because this, of course, is our largest labor market,
Yes.
for Sri Lanka, not just for Sri Lanka, but for India, Philippines, and so on. If you get a bad recession in the Middle East, that might affect that stream of revenue as well.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that, look, the immediate future is kind of bleak. It's going to be bad news for the oil-producing countries, but also for a whole range of commodity-producing countries. A whole range of manufacturing-producing companies is bad news overall. And it's also bad news for those who rely on services like tourism. Remittances likely to come down as well. yes, this is that typical impact of the recession. So I think we can't deny that the coming year or the rest of this year is bad news. The question then is, how do you deal with that? Now, if we say that our only hopes are to send our labor off to work as domestic workers in Saudi Arabia, or it's to send very cheap exports based on the blood and sweat of garment workers or tea plantation workers, no, then of course, yes, you will be much worse off. But if you say, no, we can actually think of a different trajectory of growth, where maybe you don't get a very high rate of growth, but it's more evenly spread, where more people benefit from it, where more people from the bottom's incomes rise, and where you provide the basic needs of people, the essential goods and services, then maybe that's not such a disaster after all.
So time for a lot of brainstorming, a lot of discussion within countries and among countries, and let's see what countries come up with, what regions come up with, and organizations as well. Thank you very much to Professor Jayati Ghosh, the well-known economist who is here in Colombo, fortunately for us. And thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away because the news is coming up next. Have a great evening.